In this section, we'll discuss the ways that the body manages thermal transfer to and from its surface and from one part of the body to another, using the mechanisms that we discussed in the Basics of Thermal Transfer section. The body core is continuously producing energy by digesting and metabolizing food. The core is the hottest part of the body, and the body works to maintain that core temperature within a very narrow range, between about 97.7 and 99.5 degrees Fahrenheit. You can think of the core as the furnace of the body, or where your body heat comes from. Body heat is distributed around the body by way of the circulatory system. If the core is the furnace of the body, the circulatory system is the radiators, or the HVAC system. Blood is pumped continuously around the body by the heart, and it completes a full circuit in about 1 or 2 minutes. Larger blood vessels branch into smaller and smaller capillaries to reach all of the body's tissues. In some places, the larger vessels are near the surface, such as the neck and the wrists. The rate of blood flow around the body is controlled by the heart, which beats more slowly when less circulation is needed and faster when more is needed. You may have heard people say things like 80% of heat is lost through your head. As you see here, the head does have plenty of circulation, but not more than the rest of the body. The reason that a larger proportion of body heat is often lost through the head in cold weather is that it's usually the only part of the body that's not covered. So if you covered everything but your right leg, 80% of your body heat would be lost through your right leg. But some people do lose heat more quickly through their heads than others, due to differences in the amount and type of hair that covers their head. The circulatory system delivers heat from the core to the surface of the body through circulating blood. So to control that transport, the smaller vessels can expand and contract to allow more or less blood to reach the surface. When vessels contract, it's called vasoconstriction, and when they expand, it's called vasodilation. Vasoconstriction and vasodilation are the first line of defense in regulating body temperature in different environments. There are 2 mechanisms that control these vascular responses to temperature changes: a closed-loop response at the periphery and then a central response through the brain. The closed-loop response acts like this. When sensory receptors in the skin sense a temperature change, they immediately initiate vasoconstriction or vasodilation without communicating with the brain. The central response, on the other hand, senses the temperature of the blood that's getting back to the brain. If it's too cold, then the brain will cause vessels to constrict, and if it's too warm, it'll cause them to dilate. The central response tends to be driven by whole body temperature changes, while the peripheral response is driven by what's happening to that specific part of the skin. For example, on a very hot day, your brain might be telling all the vessels of your body to dilate to release more body heat into the environment. But if you touched a block of ice, the sensory receptors in your hand would detect that change and immediately cause the vessels of the hand to constrict to keep blood away from that cold source. However, if your body core got hot enough, the central response could override that peripheral response. It's also important to note that warming and cooling responses are different systems. There are twice as many cold receptors as heat receptors in the skin, and the physiological responses for heat and cold are driven by different receptors that don't act in exactly the same way. In cold environments, vasoconstriction is the first line of defense. It keeps blood from reaching the outer surface of the body and helps to retain the heat that the blood is transporting. The second thing that happens is that tiny erector pili muscles that are attached to each hair in the skin contract and pull that hair into an upright position. In most humans, this doesn't have a really significant effect since our body hair is relatively sparse. The reaction is left over from when we were furrier, and increasing the height of that hair layer helped to trap more air and prevent heat from being lost. But even the way that it is today, this response does have a small effect on increasing the insulative air layer that's trapped around the body. The last thing that happens is that we start shivering. Shivering is an involuntary muscle contraction. Muscle activity releases heat as a byproduct of the energy conversion that's happening in the muscle cells. So shivering increases the amount of extra heat that the body is producing. So what happens when your body gets colder and colder? One side effect of vasoconstriction is that blood pressure goes up because there's less room for the same amount of blood when the vessels at the periphery are closed off. To manage that increase in blood pressure, the body starts getting rid of some of the water in the blood by producing urine. This is why you might start to feel a stronger urge to use the bathroom when you've been outside in the cold for a while. Because blood flow is important to the function of sensory and motor neurons, as well as muscle fibers, as vasoconstriction continues, dexterity and sensitivity start to decrease. A rule of thumb, no pun intended, is that good dexterity is maintained above about 54 degrees Fahrenheit and good sensitivity is maintained above about 46 degrees. If vasoconstriction continues, eventually there's no blood flow at all in the skin, and the skin turns really pasty white. This is called frostnip. It's reversible and it doesn't do any damage, but it's the first sign of potential danger for this tissue. If the skin becomes cold enough that crystals can form in fluids, this is called cold burn, and it has a similar effect as heat burns. The tissue will be damaged, but it's usually not very deep. Deeper damage is caused if the cold temperature gets into the lower layers of skin and muscle, or if blood flow is restricted for too long. That's when frostbite sets in, which you know as the cause for losing fingers and toes and more serious injuries that happen when a lot of tissue dies. Finally, in really severe prolonged cold exposure, vasoconstriction continues to progress inwards towards the core. Eventually, blood flow to the brain is compromised and hypothermia will set in. If this goes on for too long, then the person will die. If you've lived in Minnesota or other cold climates, you may have heard stories of people who have frozen to death for various reasons. In those cases, it's not uncommon to find the person partially or totally naked, which seems strange when someone is freezing to death. This happens because right before death, the brain throws out a last-ditch effort to save tissue and floods the body with blood. The abrupt change makes the person feel really warm, and because they're probably also confused due to restricted blood flow to the brain, they start to take off clothing. This same effect is caused by alcohol, fever, and the hot flashes that women experience during menopause. All three disrupt the regulatory system between the brain and the sensory neurons and cause too much blood flow relative to the environmental temperature. You sense that hot blood in the skin, You can sense that hot blood in the skin and interpret it as being warm. Nope. When you feel hot blood in the skin, it feels like being warm. And that can be dangerous because heat is still being lost. So for example, a drunk person might feel very warm because the alcohol is inhibiting the vasoconstriction response, but they're still losing heat to the environment and still at risk for later stage effects of heat loss. A similar but less hazardous effect happens in the hands, feet, and face during prolonged cold exposure. To prevent cold burn or frostbite, the brain floods these areas with blood periodically just to keep the temperature in a safe zone. This is known as the cold-induced vasodilation response, or CIVD, and it kicks in about 5 or 10 minutes after exposure to a cold environment. The frequency and magnitude of the response varies between individuals. People with better aerobic fitness seem to have a better CIVD response, as do people who are frequently exposed to cold environments, and it's also affected by race, diet, altitude, age, and stress. In warm environments, vasodilation is again the first line of defense. Opening up the capillaries helps to move more of the body's core heat toward the surface where it can be released. Another effect of heat on the body is an increase in breathing rate. This does two things. First, it supports the increased heart rate that moves blood around faster, and second, it moves air in and out of the lungs. Remember that air is also warmed by the body, so cooler air coming into the lungs takes on some of the core heat and moves it back out into the environment when it's expelled. Animals with heavy fur coats rely heavily on this mechanism because the fur layer inhibits the effectiveness of vasodilation and sweating. This is why dogs pant really hard in warm environments. Perhaps the most effective mechanism the body has to release heat is sweating. If you remember our discussion of phase change, sweating exists to do exactly that, to create moisture on the skin surface so that it can evaporate. As it evaporates, it takes thermal energy with it. Remember that the transition from liquid to gas phase requires energy, and the phase change process speeds up that transfer of energy. Evaporating sweat leaves residue though, especially salt crystals. If sweat glands become plugged, they can get red and inflamed, and we call this heat rash. Just as vasoconstriction increases blood pressure, vasodilation decreases blood pressure. If vasodilation goes too far, there's not enough blood to maintain a good pressure within that larger volume. Blood has trouble getting to the brain, and this can cause fainting. Dehydration also contributes to fainting. As water is lost through sweating, it can't be used to increase the blood volume, and this also contributes to lowering blood pressure. The accumulation of these symptoms over a long period of time is called heat stroke, and it can be fatal if it's not reversed. Any one of these things is not good for long-term survival of body tissues. More acute focused thermal transfer, of course, leads to burns, both from contact and from radiation, like a sunburn. Over time, if the body core temperature remains too high, the sensitive proteins and enzymes that make up our cells will start to denature or cook, and this, of course, would eventually lead to death. But let's return to sweat, since this is such a critical mechanism in thermal balance and so important in wearable products. Sweat rates vary over the body's surface and between men and women, as you can see in this diagram. Men tend to overall sweat more and sooner than women do. For men, sweat is heavier over the shoulders and upper chest and across the back. For women, sweat is concentrated down the spine and under the breasts. The onset of sweating also varies across individuals. People who are more physically fit tend to sweat earlier and sweat more. However, even with no physical activity at all, we are always losing moisture into the environment. This evaporation of sweat is called insensible perspiration, as opposed to sweating that's triggered by another response, which is called sensible perspiration. All sweat is not equal, and temperature is not the only trigger of sweating. So far, we've only talked about the kind of sweat that comes from being too warm, which is called eccrine sweat. We also sweat due to hormonal changes or stress. This kind of sweat is released by apocrine sweat glands, which also host bacteria that break down sweat. And the byproducts of breaking down sweat is what causes body odor. We'll talk about this more in the hygiene section. As I mentioned, sweat is a really effective way to transfer heat to the environment. But in order for that to work, the sweat has to actually evaporate. There are many conditions in which that doesn't happen. For example, if the air is already saturated with humidity, sweat won't evaporate. This is why people talk about a dry heat being more comfortable than a wet heat. In a dry environment, sweat evaporates much faster and does a much better job of cooling the body down. If there's an impermeable barrier around the body, like a spacesuit, the sweat has nowhere to go. The problem is that the body doesn't have a mechanism that stops sweat when it's not working. In conditions where sweat's not evaporating and cooling you, you'll continue to sweat and become more uncomfortable, even though it's not actually doing anything. On the other hand, in conditions where sweat is working, triggering a sweat response can do a lot to cool the body. We've talked about sweating because body temperature is elevated due to environmental conditions or exercise, but body temperature can also be artificially increased by consuming hot food or drink, or even by eating spicy foods. In some hot climates, people do these things to cool down, which might sound counterproductive, but if the trigger triggers a useful sweating response, the overall result can be to actually cool down the body once the sweat evaporates. Finally, I'd like to say a few things about perception and adaptation. Every person has a thermal set point, which is the temperature range in which their body is comfortable. This is different between different people, which you will know if you've ever shared an environment with someone whose set point is different than yours. The set point is not fixed, however. Evidence shows that it can be trained in one direction or another. It takes about 30 days of consistent exposure to a higher or lower temperature to shift that set point up or down a little. So by the end of a cold winter, you may be comfortable in cooler temperatures than you were at the beginning, and the same applies to a hot summer. Indoor climate control inhibits this, since the body is not exposed to extremely higher or lower temperatures. So set point can differ, but all of us experience temperature in similar ways. Perception of thermal comfort is much more heavily influenced by the hands, the feet, and the face than the rest of the body. This is why in cool temperatures, a pair of gloves can sometimes make more of a difference than a coat. And in hot temperatures, running your hands under cold water is a great way to feel cooler fast. Many studies have established the skin temperature of the finger as being the best predictor of overall thermal comfort.